Welcome, everyone. I hope you're having a great day. I wanted to do something a little different today. It's not really just a reaction video, but more of just a discussion about a period of history that I'm particularly fascinated by right now, and that's World War I. Specifically, I want to talk today about the sinking of the Lusitania. Here in the United States, growing up, learning history, Lusitania is often spoken about as one of those things that led to the United States entering the war. But the real story is a lot more complicated than that, and it's not nearly as black and white as the propaganda of the day on the Allied side would have folks to believe. So I don't want to get real detailed into the conversation, but I just want to talk a little bit about the Lusitania, about what happened that day. We're actually going to watch a video that was put together by another YouTube channel, and the link is in the description below to that video, where they put together kind of a recreation of the Lusitania sinking in real time. And it's only about 18 minutes long because that's about all it took for this to actually happen. So I'm going to give you just a real quick background into this, and then we'll talk more about Lusitania as we watch that sinking unfold. So Lusitania is built, I think, in 1907. It was subsidized by the British government because they knew that if war came, they might actually confiscate the vessel for use as an armed merchant ship. And so they subsidized the building of these ships with that in mind. It was built outside of Glasgow, Scotland, in a shipyard there, registered in Liverpool. Pretty substantial size ship, almost 800 feet long, 40+ thousand tons displacement. Lusitania was a passenger ship first and foremost, and in 1915, when she was sunk, though it was spun by the Allies as being the sinking of an unarmed passenger vessel, she was carrying many tons of weaponry on board. So let's get a little bit more into that topic. So if you're a student of World War I, you know that the German Navy, for the most part, other than the Battle of Jutland, was largely confined to U-boats. They didn't do a whole lot with their surface fleet outside of Jutland. And so U-boats were their primary way of combating the blockade by the Entente of their ports, keeping shipping from getting in. And so they declared what they called an exclusion zone around the British Isles. And they said that anything inside that exclusion zone, regardless of what type of ship it was subject to what they call unrestricted submarine warfare. And so the Lusitania, by that declaration, was fair game. Now, Lusitania was not, as I mentioned, simply a passenger vessel. She was, that day, carrying over 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, .303 caliber. They've actually brought up a lot of that .303 caliber ammunition from the wreckage site. 5,000 shrapnel casings totaling about 50 tons, 3,240 brass percussion fuses, in addition to 1,266 passengers and a crew of 696. Now, that's all what we officially know. Unofficially, there probably was a lot more on board, and that may have contributed to how quickly she sank. So we're going to go ahead and watch this video, and I'll talk a little bit more about Lusitania, about what happened that day, and about the aftermath, as well as react to that video, because I don't know a lot about what actually took place from the time the torpedo hit the ship until the time that she sank. So it's 18 kilometers, about 11 miles off the southern coast of Ireland, so pretty close to shore. The water was about 52 degrees that day. It was a single torpedo from a German U-boat that hit. And you can see, man, how quickly she immediately starts listing to the starboard side. So, I mean, that was instantaneous. Now, this is one of those things, that second unknown explosion that rocks the ship, that may very well have been caused by some of the ammunition that was on board. One of the things that happens on board the Lusitania is that there's just a lot of, because she's sinking so fast, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of panic going on, and a lot of problems with some of the lifeboats early on. But surprisingly, A significant number of people did survive as quickly as she sank. I believe she moved about 2 miles after being hit before coming to a stop. One of the issues in the aftermath of the investigation that made things rather difficult was that there was a lot of secrecy because this is wartime. So there was a lot of military secrecy around what Lusitania may or may not have been carrying. And so the government really kind of got in the way of the investigation. And so there's a lot of questions to this day about exactly what happened. Captain Turner orders hard to starboard, which is actually the same order that was given on board the Titanic to try and avoid the torpedo. Hard to starboard actually would involve a turn to the left, which seems counterintuitive since left is port side. But one of the tragedies of the Lusitania is that they're only 11 miles offshore, but it takes 3 hours for any rescue ships to arrive. And the captain had a lot of trouble getting anything to work. The engines aren't responding. The turning isn't responding. Everything he's trying to do to try and right the ship, to try and give them a fighting chance, is just not working at all. Interestingly, the captain survived the sinking. Near the end, he was standing on the deck with the ship's logbooks, and a wave hits and knocks him overboard, and he ends up clinging onto a chair. And that's how he survives the sinking. A lot of people survived the sinking into the water, but even though the water was significantly warmer than, say, the water with the Titanic, it was still 52 degrees. And the fact that it took 3 hours for rescue ships to get there cost a lot of lives that otherwise probably could have been saved. Oh, jeez. So that's 3 lifeboats gone right off the bat. My goodness. All electrical power is lost within the first 5 minutes. So that tells you a lot about what must be going on underneath, that the water's pouring in so fast that quickly. Because the Titanic had electricity until something like 12. And I know I'm talking a lot about Titanic, but Titanic's the same time period, similar ship design, slightly bigger, but about the same size as Lusitania. So there's a lot of comparisons to be made. Titanic held on to its power well until maybe the last half hour before the sinking. There's a lot of speculation that Winston Churchill, who I think was First Lord of the Admiralty at this point, may have known that there was a threat of... He's already given the order to abandon ship at this point. May have known there was a threat of U-boats to ships like the Lusitania and intentionally did nothing about it because they knew that it would bring the U.S. into the war. But, it's interesting because a lot of people point to this as one of the reasons that the United States gets involved in the war, but it's another 2 years after this, almost exactly 2 years, like a year and 11 months before the U.S. finally enters the war. Geez, boat 16 breaks apart while lowering. So that's the first 4 lifeboats. None of them are in the water yet at this point. And you have to imagine the panic that's going on board. You've got, something like 2,000 people on board this ship. And it's going down fast, and they're panicking, trying to get on up to the deck. First of all, there's 9 decks on this ship, so if you're down near the bottom, you're fighting crowds just to get up to the top. And if this thing it sank in 18 minutes, probably a lot of people never even made it to the deck. But yeah, there's a lot of speculation about what did Churchill know, and did he allow this to happen. There's a lot of talk too that about the fact that this is pretty early in the war. This is only, this is less than a year into World War I. And so they're still figuring out how to deal with U-boats, how to maneuver to avoid being hit by a torpedo, what your tactics should be even as a civilian vessel like the Lusitania. You can see now she's really starting to go down. Skipping ahead a little bit now. So you can start to see still no lifeboats have been successfully lowered into the water, and we're about 8 minutes into the sinking. It's almost halfway. So the German boat that sinks, U-boat that sinks Lusitania is the U-20. Interesting story, just a couple of days before this, the U-20 had sunk another British passenger vessel, but that one they had actually stopped the vessel. They had surfaced, stopped the vessel, allowed all the passengers and crew to get off the ship, and then sank it. But this time they didn't do that, and I'm not entirely sure what the reason was for that, but that was part of the controversy. And part of how it was spun in the press was, hey, look, they did this before, and then this time they don't allow that, and 1,200 people end up dying, including a number of Americans. Another lifeboat capsizes, this one after rubbing against the hull. You can see, I mean, obviously there's an issue because of the angle at which it's going down, so I'm sure there were people on board this lifeboat when it was going down. My goodness. What a mess. U-20, about a year later, ends up grounding off the Danish coast. They've slowed enough to attempt to launch the boat. So there was the issue. She was going too fast to be able to launch the lifeboat. So that's a major problem. U-20 ends up getting grounded and abandoned by her crew. And it sat there for something like 10 years before the Danish government blew it up in what they called a spectacular explosion, which must have been quite something to see. Another interesting thing about this is only 300 feet of water here. Lusitania is almost 800 feet long. So depending on the angle at which she went down, which I think I did a little trigonometry, and if I did it right, if the stern was up anything higher than 22 degrees when the boat sank, then the bow would have hit the bottom before the stern was under the water. I think I did that right. So kind of an interesting thing to think about with all of this. Or maybe it was 60 degrees. I don't remember. One of the angles was 22 degrees. The other one was 68 degrees. So it might have been 68 degrees this way, I'm not sure, but either way it's certainly possible. But I think Lusitania sank at a pretty steady angle. It wasn't real high up in the air like you think of the Titanic. Now we got another problem with releasing a lifeboat. You got two going down at this point. Oh, this is just a nightmare. Not one successful lifeboat yet. And we're what? We're 11 minutes in. This thing's got 7 minutes before it goes under. And not a single lifeboat has successfully been launched. We're about to have one, it looks like. What? Boat 9 is never released and is dragged down with the ship. That's what, 6 lifeboats without a single one successful? Is this one going to make it? The forecastle begins to submerge. Boat 1 is launched successfully. Congratulations. We got one boat in the water successfully. And the front of the ship's almost down. We got more disaster happening on the port side, spilling its passengers into the sea. How horrifying this must have been for these passengers watching this, especially the ones sitting in the other lifeboats, wondering what's going to happen to ours. We're like 1 for 10 at this point. Jeez. And kudos to the guy who put this together. This is a really well done simulation. Boat 14 rights itself. Its plug is fixed into place. Is this one going to make it? Looks pretty low in the water. It capsized 6 times. Only 11 of its 60 occupants stayed on board until rescue. Jeez. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, unlike most sinkings like this, to have Captain Turner actually having survived this. And then I'm sure he was very heavily involved in the investigation. And he had kept really detailed logs. In fact, the last time they had recorded their position was just 2 minutes before the torpedo hit. and they know they traveled 2 miles after that. So it was actually, especially with only 300 feet of water, it was actually very easy for them to find the wreckage. And to this day, you know, I mean, we're talking, what, 3 years after the Titanic? Lusitania's wreck is in very, very poor condition compared to the wreck of the Titanic. It's almost unrecognizable as a ship as it once was. And I think part of that is because it sank so fast and at such a degree of an angle that it hit pretty hard. You know, Titanic sank pretty fast as well. But because it was in 2 miles of water, it had a chance to kind of settle and more or less hit the bottom intact. Boat 21 on the stern is launched successfully. There's 2. All right. Lusitania begins her plunge. She has traveled 2 miles since the torpedo strike. And we've got, what, about 3.5 minutes now until she sinks. And look, I mean, by and large, most of the ship is still above water. But, you know, once you get to a certain point, it just goes down really fast. So, yeah, for a while after this, and I don't know how quickly after this it was, but for a while, Germany did stop their unrestricted submarine warfare, but they resumed it again. And that, combined with the Zimmermann telegram, which is this famous telegram where supposedly the German government has reached out to the Mexican government. The Mexican government had just undergone kind of a civil war of its own, and the U.S. had sent troops into Mexico. So the Germans are trying to capitalize on that, and they're like promising Mexico that they'll get some of their land back that they lost during the Mexican-American War. Boat 9 founders is dragged under by the ship. And so that, combined with the return of unrestricted submarine warfare, kind of is the final straw that allows Wilson to get his excuse to go to war, and the U.S. declares war on Germany in April of 1917. Some survivors report hearing roars and explosions as the ship founders. And they, to this day, have not really been able to determine a lot of things about this because the ship's in such poor condition. It's hard to really get a sense of how the damage was caused, how much damage there was. Here's where Captain Turner is swept from the port bridge wing into the sea. And now you can see how quickly she's going under. Oh, goodness. How awful that must have been. And again, only 11 miles off the southern coast of Ireland. Should have been fairly easy to get people there, and they'd sent distress signals. I'm not entirely familiar enough with the story to know exactly why it was that it took them 3 hours to get somebody there. I mean, Titanic was hundreds of miles off the coast of Canada, and people got there quicker. Of course, there weren't U-boats in the water, you know, threatening to sink ships. So maybe that had something to do with it. But there she goes. She's going under fast. Boy, they barely got any lifeboats out. Boat 15 floats away but is dragged down by rigging. Oh, what an absolute disaster. They didn't even have time to get most of those boats in the water. How many did they get in the water successfully? 3 or 4? The only people who survived, for the most part, were floating in the water. And I think they only recovered a few hundred bodies. They recovered about as many bodies from this as they did from Titanic. They'd actually offered cash rewards to fishermen and people who had boats if they would find the bodies and recover them. And the bodies kind of, you know, some of them ended up in Wales. You know, some of them ended up in Ireland. I think a lot of them they buried in Queenstown. So there she goes. She's under at that point. And it was a pretty shallow angle, so I'm guessing she didn't hit the bottom before they went under. Flying an American flag, incidentally. Probably in hopes of not being sunk for that reason. And that's it. 18 minutes. Only 764 survivors. So pretty similar numbers of survivors to how many survived the Titanic. But that was very cool. So that is, by the way, Titanic Animations is the name of the YouTube site, or the YouTube channel that put that together. So check them out. Give them a like if you would, and check out some of their other stuff. Let me know your thoughts about the Lusitania. Let's have a conversation about what happened. fill in what I forgot to mention or what I wasn't aware of. I hope you enjoyed this. Hit that like button, and we will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.